Oh, yes, Tim.
All right, thank you all for joining us today here on the Streaming Media Advanced Forum. I'm Tim Siglin, contributing editor for Streaming Media Magazine and the media strategy principal at Real Software Incorporated. We have our usual host of suspects, Dom and Mark, who I'll hand over to in just a moment. Eric's not able to be with us today, but he sends his regards. And then we've got a couple of guests who all of us have known for a number of years. Dom, I'm going to cut to you because you've got this wonderful sort of red glow around you. Tell me what you want to sort of talk about today on the.
I think I'd say one of my posts went out in the magazine today, which is about just general impressions of the last 3 months of conferences. It's been quite a slew of them this autumn. I don't know if you guys have had equally busy autumns, but it just seemed like it was conference crazy this autumn. And I think so I did a whole bunch of carrier ones alongside of the Streaming Media and IBC. And so, yeah, I've got some stuff to bring up in the front of my mind.
Yeah, we'll come back around and talk about that. Mark, introduce yourself and kind of give me a topic you're interested in.
Hey, I'm Mark East. I'm the founder of Own I Know Media, and the one from the Flipboard that was interesting to me most is something that we touched on in our last meeting, and I think in the one before that, which is the continued abstraction of YouTube from Amazon. And all of their many platforms. So yeah, I'd love to touch on that at some point.
Okay, awesome. We'll totally do that. And now, from a guest standpoint, we have first David Syed. David, introduce yourself and give us a quick overview. We were talking before. I think you've been in the industry for about 12 years now. Where did you start, and how did you get to where you are?
That sounds about right. Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. So I got my start in the streaming media industry when I was with Microsoft, and I worked on various technologies like smooth streaming, Silverlight, Azure Media Services, or rather what became Azure Media Services. Then I went to AWS, Amazon Web Services, built the Elastic Transcoder service for Amazon. And most recently went and still am with Brightcove, where I run product strategy for the media business. And during the 4 years of Brightcove, we've had a lot of interesting new media products and technologies come out, which maybe we can touch on because I think they hit some common industry themes at the moment, such as how you do better video with lower bandwidth and other interesting topics like that.
Yeah,
so that's kind of my potted history. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. My background is enterprise software. So before I joined Microsoft, I was with Oracle and PeopleSoft and the big enterprise ERP companies. And but I was always doing video as a sideline. So I lived in the Bay Area at the time. I did a lot of event video when I was down there. I did corporate video type stuff from a production standpoint. So I've always sort of had my hand dabbling into the creative side of video, which I actually find quite useful when it comes to thinking through streaming scenarios and things like that, because I think all of us have some of that experience and we have an understanding as to what it actually takes to get the bits into the system to start off with from the camera.
Good, yeah, and I definitely look forward to talking about some of the context-aware encoding, because obviously that's been a topic you and I have discussed quite a bit. In fact, we talked about that briefly, you and I, and then Anil at Stream Media West during those interviews.
That's right.
Which I guess are now live on the streamingmedia.com website.
Yes, I believe they are.
Good. All right, and then Matt. Matt, I've known you probably a bit longer than David, but you've been in the industry probably the longest of all of us, or pretty close, because you started back with Cuban way back in the day. So give us your history.
Yeah, and since I don't have the lower third, I'll hold up that so everybody can see. Not analog lower third, but yeah, I got into streaming actually at the local TV station level. The early days of MSNBC and NetShow, what Microsoft's Windows Media became known as.
Yeah, their video conferencing tool.
That's right. Very, very early days, putting together, streaming video out of news packages and sound bites at the local station level. and then joined an owned and operated station here in Dallas, doing that, and then made my way to broadcast.com and Yahoo. Gosh, with stops along the way at Inlet Technologies and Vivio. I went back to work with some of the broadcast folks and did a video startup called Chidio that is still kicking and trying to revolutionize how you charitably give and watch video at the same time. And then more recently with Envato, that's now part of Google, and now with the great folks at Bright Cove, where I am the principal evangelist and chief talker about all things video.
Very good. Well, and prior to all that, if I remember correctly, you were up here in the East Tennessee region and actually worked at a TV station as well, right?
I was. My final 2 years of school, I was, in class in the mornings and on the air in the evenings, and got a couple of odd looks from folks and people that would see me at the Food Lion there and say they'd saw me on the TV last night. So very beautiful part of the country that I'm still fond of, and East Tennessee is a great place. And yeah, it was a great place to start my TV career.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk about a topic that you brought up on LinkedIn, and we've got it on the Flipboard for those who are watching us on the SMAdvancedForum.com. They can actually see a link to the Flipboard with the top stories. Talk to me about this issue of measurement, especially because politically NFL attendance and ratings, has arguably been down. Part of what you were saying on LinkedIn is that this issue has to be addressed because it doesn't account for streaming. So tell me what your thinking is around that.
Yeah, it's a great preamble, and I think it goes beyond the NFL, although the focus of the article is on the NFL. So the hypothesis is that we don't have a very effective means for measuring streaming audiences in general, but specifically for live audiences. As you alluded to, the NFL is trying to understand this ball of yarn that is declining attendance in the stadiums, the kneeling issues, the maybe violence that's driving people away. It could be a ton of things. I don't want to sidetrack on that, but it's manifesting itself certainly in their TV ratings, which are down. Yet some evidence suggests that the views of their streaming content is up. They've been very, very methodical about extending their brand to other platforms, through the deal with Amazon, through the deal with Twitter. But the overlying thought here with this thread is that they're not able to properly measure the audience, and specifically the live audience, and that's a problem that needs to be fixed immediately. As a sidebar, I'd point your attention to Steve Levitan, who is the executive producer of Modern Family. Just a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, he threw a really hot sports opinion out there that said, if we measured the viewership of Modern Family online and combined it with people who watch live on whatever that is, Wednesday nights on ABC, that the audience would be much more sizable and that he would be able to charge the studios more to produce his show. I don't pretend to understand how that model works, but I think he's got a point in that, like the other idea with the NFL, we're not measuring these audiences properly.
So let me ask a question on that, because one of the things that Nielsen has tried to do, and of course Bright Cove, Adobe, a number of other companies who have media players and media platforms are, ostensibly working with Nielsen to figure out these measurement models. One of the models they posited was this whole essentially 30 days, where it was live plus the 30 days after, and that's where we get measurements. Part of what I gather from this article, though, is that the issue isn't so much measuring the post-event on-demand consumption of it, it's measuring the live itself.
Correct.
Okay, and was Nielsen's decision to do that sort of just let's punt it down the road because we can't measure live properly, or what? Or we give it the 30 days because we want to get an aggregate number?
I think it's the former. I think maybe there's just not a collective understanding about how we measure these things in the moment. and perhaps it's that opposite ends of the spectrum. They come from traditional television where there are meters and they're, or they can pull the data off of the set-top box and collate it. And then in the middle, you've got those live event producers, programmers, whomever, who've said, we'd really like this to be overnight data, right? Nielsen has migrated toward that. And now you've got this three-legged animal over here that's called streaming that says, I'm completely different than all that, but I have bits and pieces of all that as well. And perhaps, the other piece of it is money. I think maybe it's just a business position where, there's a shift. Is Nielsen able to extract more revenue out of customers who have deep pockets, who are the traditional providers of this content, versus this shift we're seeing where, and higher audiences are beginning mobile first and watching content on different screens than we have in the past.
That's a good point. And I guess the other question here is, as we look at streaming only events, I think about some of the stuff beyond football, where as we come toward the Olympics and there'll be events that are only streaming, how are those particular events counted in total viewership aggregates if they're web only? Because, traditionally in the past, we've sort of delineated between broadcast television, cable television, and other, and streaming, of course, falls into the other. But how will we deal with web-only events from a counting standpoint, as you said, for being able to charge more money for a show?
Well, it's a fantastic question. I don't have the answer, but I'll amplify what you said. Beyond even the Olympics. So think about the traditional carriers who are going not subscription, but they're going untethered. So you've got DirecTV Now, you've got Sling TV, you've got these services that are robust, that are, I think we all understand, they're maybe generating profit, or at least they're off the ground, and the subscriber numbers are starting to become significant. DirecTV Now, I think, just crossed 1 million subs. So there have to be mechanisms there to measure those audiences for a variety of reasons, monetization and the cost that these organizations have to pay to acquire the content. But it has to mimic, or what I like to say is be better than broadcast, right? They've got to have the mechanisms in place to do this. So again, this is to quote Tom Clancy, it's a clear and present danger. It's something that has to be solved for today, because the problem is only going to get more complex.
And then one last question, and this is opinion only, obviously not from your employer or anything like that, but you've been around football and streaming and broadcast for a long time. This move recently to Skycam, where it looks more like Madden style football, is that because the audience wants that, or because the optics of seeing so many empty seats in a stadium in a traditional shot is, pushing the myth forward that NFL attendance or viewership overall is down?
It's a great point. Well, let's talk about the origins of it. That camera scenario began and was created by Vince McMahon with the XFL, right? They're the ones who started that. And, the NFL created it. Sure. It was it's a fresh set of eyes, right? They're trying to be an innovative product. They created a new way to look at football. It's been adopted by the college and the NFL organizations too. It's, like you say, it's a different way to look at the content, makes you feel like you're in a Madden type scenario. And even there's a third reason: when they have these crazy halftime shows and there's so much smoke in the stadium, they can't use the fixed cameras that are on the side of the venue.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
But you raise a very interesting point, and I don't pretend to have an answer. I don't have any secret guys in the production truck at NBC or at CBS. But I would suspect that is a very good way of obscuring or masking stadiums where there's not enough folks in the seats.
It's fascinating to watch college football. Clemson, obviously not too far from here, doing well. Those stands, of course, are packed versus. Right. So that was why I was curious on the optics thing.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that there is a hypothesis between Skycam versus empty seats, I think it's a byproduct, but I don't think we can directly make that correlation. Although it is a nice tool that they can use in those scenarios.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm going to flip over to Mark because the next topic on the flipbook was indeed the one that Mark wanted to talk about. So, Mark, give us a quick context of what we talked about last time and how that sort of ties in now to the topic, which is Google deals a blow to Amazon customers pulling YouTube from Fire and Echo devices.
Yeah, so I think last time I mentioned it in the context that they had pulled YouTube from the Echo, what's it called? The Echo, the one with the video screen.
Oh, I know which one you're talking about, and I'm blanking on it.
It's the Echo Show.
Echo Show. Yeah.
Thank you. There's our resident former Amazon.
Exactly. Yeah, representing Seattle.
Appreciate it. Yeah, so they pulled it from the Echo Show. They've now pulled it from Fire Stick, which has, you know, a ton more installed units than Echo Show has or will ever have, in my opinion. And so it's kind of a huge blow, I would think, to, you know, a number of people who have standardized on Amazon versus Google equipment. But when you're talking about a $30 device, Amazon's about to lose a whole lot of subscribers, or a whole lot of equipment users. They'll just buy Chromecasts.
Yeah. So interestingly, though, at the same time we're hearing this announcement, we're also hearing that Apple finally has Amazon Prime on Apple TV. So,
right.
So the question there becomes, okay, if they can't use Fire, but they can use Apple TV to get both their Prime Video and YouTube, is it possible that it pushes sales for Apple TV as opposed to, say, Chromecasts?
That's absolutely possible. And you're also, you know, it's also recently announced that YouTube TV is moving to, you know, Apple TV, Roku, et cetera. So, you know, it's kind of a 1-2 punch from Google, if you will. They're pulling it away from Amazon and blowing it out to a bunch more platforms, including their relatively new live service. You know, I think it's going to make some waves.
Well, and I think too, what's interesting is it may have impact on both Google hardware sales and Amazon hardware sales to the benefit of Roku and Apple. But I think ultimately what we're seeing here, and I'd be curious on your take, is are we suddenly seeing Google essentially having to reposition itself, because it's putting this on so many other devices, reposition itself as a services company only and moving away from hardware? Or is this just, we hate Amazon so much, we're going to stick it to Amazon while we give everybody else more access rather than less?
Well, I don't know if Google's going to need to move away from their hardware business. I think the important distinction to make here is that Google is not a retailer. They have a retail business, certainly, but they're not primarily a retailer. The issues with Amazon. Sorry, say again?
So it's complementary. It helps their other initiatives.
Yeah, it's not a have to have. You're right. It's an additive.
Absolutely, and the issues that have sprung up between Amazon and Google are, you know, fundamentally center around Amazon's retail business and the fact that they're not allowing certain or they're not featuring certain products in their retail business. So, you know, I think. When it comes to Google doing deals with Apple or with Roku or with anybody else out there who's also not a retailer, you know, those issues just aren't a consideration. It'll be interesting to see, however, once Apple releases HomePod in the coming year, what happens to those deals that Google has made with Apple, and if that device has been considered in the existing deals.
You know, I think about Alexa and I think about Cortana and a number of these others, and people have asked me if I would recommend them, and my answer is no from a privacy standpoint, because we've already seen court cases where, since it records those snippets and since those snippets get uploaded, that it's actually incredibly easy, if there's something illicit or illegal going on, to use that in a court case because it's already captured. They're always on devices. Apple, it'll be interesting to see, because, you know, they have that very big sort of, we won't touch the privacy of people's iPhones, and yet Siri obviously also records content. The only way it works is if you're on internet, so it can upload that. So I think the HomePod piece will be, and even the new iMac Pros are going to have an A10 chip built in so that Siri can stay on. So essentially, we're reaching a point where all these devices have the ability to record, and it will create a whole nother set of questions around privacy as well.
Hey, Tim, I have an on-topic related comment I wanted to explore with the group.
Please.
So, first world problem clearly, but new Apple TV, right? I'm, in this group. I'm excited about 4K, excited about HDR, and it occurs to me that these devices may be a little trickier than most people think, and I wonder what the common, non-video head experience is like with these devices. So I'm switching out the previous generation Apple TV for my brand new spanking shiny one that does 4K, and the process of going through to enable HDR is actually quite tricky. So much so that I've discovered that the HDMI cable feeding my 4K television was the 1.0 spec. It didn't have the 2.0 bits available to where you could get a high
1.4, you can't do that either. Yeah.
Right. So trip to Sam's Club, get 2 new cables, get back there and get everything connected, and so everything's working. Right. I can watch Apple's 4K content. I'm great, but I get over to Netflix and I've got a problem watching Stranger Things. I've got a problem even watching. There's some great test patterns for you real video nerds in the audience. I mean, you can really get deep in the weeds and check your bandwidth, check your frame rate. I mean, it's even better than the Netflix clip that we all heard about a couple of years back.
I think Gary Kaplan just paid you to talk about that, given the fact that he has a number of those that he sells for a lot of money.
Yeah, so I'm enjoying this, but also being frustrated by it. Well, I eventually get to play Stranger Things in 4K, so I'm very proud of myself. Well, later that evening, a couple family members gather in the living room to watch it, and we can't get it to play through this brand new Apple TV. Get it to play through the Samsung Smart TV. So, long story short, to bring this all to a bow, turns out, and then it's compounded yesterday, by the way. As someone mentioned, I installed the new Prime Video app on the new Apple TV, and I can watch Bosch and brilliant HDR. It looks fantastic. Kudos, Amazon. But I go back to Netflix, and once again can't watch any content on that device. Well, it turns out that Netflix says that I need a DNS refresh with my service provider. So these are all things that those of us.
And Apple also released an update yesterday, apparently not to force everything into HDR, to allow it to follow content, which I think, just to say, you're right, the average person doesn't know this stuff. It just doesn't work, and who do they blame, and what do they take back?
Right. So, again, to this audience, everyone's nodding their heads going, okay, I get that, I get that, I get that. But we're the people who build these things. We're the people who design these things. In the case of Apple, the expectation is you open the box, you plug it in, it works, right? Everything just kind of just happens. So this is I think a blocker. I don't know if the average consumer would have taken that hockey puck and put it back in the box and taken it back to the Apple Store or Best Buy. And I'm still working through it.
Here's the interesting thing on that, Matt, is Apple may have an opportunity to upsell televisions that they say are guaranteed to work with Apple TV 4K HDR, but that would be a really small pool, because obviously what they're having to do with this is connect it to devices they have no control over. And I think, if you think about Apple's history, it's only been recently that they've even stopped selling a computer monitor, because before, if you bought a Mac Mini, they wanted you to buy their monitor to guarantee that it worked. Mac Pro, same thing. So this is Apple having to sort of jump into a market at the time that it's maturing, where when they came out with the Apple TV 3rd gen, obviously HDMI 1.0 had been firmly established for a couple of years. So,
right, and this, I would argue too, I agree with what you said, and this landscape's even more complex, because this is a device on which they can tick those boxes and say, our 4K content works, Amazon's 4K content works. You know, Netflix, shrug. And, you know, but as the consumer, the expectation is that it will just work. And that wasn't the case here.
You sold me 4K HDR. It should work in that. Dom, do you get 4K content on Netflix over in the UK?
Oh, we get the badge that it's promoted, and you're supposed to be able to get it. But I've got a 1986 TV, so it's just. I have no affectation at all towards 4K as a consumer.
So you have neither H nor D nor R.
No, although just to pick up on the conversation, I think it's something. It's just from some personal experience. I was doing some documentation for one of the companies we've been talking about their HDR and how to create HDR with FFmpeg using their codecs. And it's been an interesting exercise because I don't normally go beyond here is the codec, how do you want it configured? If you're fussy, then we'll go away from the defaults, but codec tweaking and optimization really isn't my thing per se. So it was quite interesting taking a bit of a dive into HDR because I can handle configuring a non-HDR a codec for non-HDR compression, but configuring codecs for HDR compression is another school again, and it really disconcerted me, thinking that I've got a couple of decades of playing with streaming tech. I should know what I'm doing to just type the HDR flag and hit go, and oh my god, it is so nothing like that at all to get HDR encoding. It's very target sensitive. There's several different modes of doing HDR. From an engineering point of view, it's a different ballgame again to understanding brightness and contrast settings. It's just a million light years from that, and it was the first time in quite a while that I actually spent a little bit of time feeling like I was drowning, trying to learn new stuff really quickly to essentially just flick a switch and say, okay, now this output is HDR compliant.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's just this whole new, set of complexity, whether it's, dealing with color space, whether it's dealing with the codec that you choose, whether it's, figuring out what kind of EOTF is transfer functions being used by the screen. And the BBC and NHK are pushing one flavor, Dolby's pushing another flavor. It's a mess, and it feels like it's easy to blame the consumer electronics manufacturers, but I don't think they're the only ones who've kind of screwed all this up. I think they started it by 3 years ago starting to sell UHD TVs that were 4K kind of, but didn't do any HDR or anything like that. So you've got people who bought 4K TVs who now can't play any HDR content whatsoever. So you've got that going on. But I mean, back to the point about Apple, it's kind of interesting how they're now in a world where they almost have the Microsoft compatibility issue that Microsoft always had with Windows, right? So it's no longer this vertically integrated ecosystem that they're playing in, and it's going to be interesting, right? How do they solve that? Do they come out with the fabled Apple TV that actually is a screen with the integrated Apple TV tvOS and maybe their own streaming service? I think that's going to be fascinating to see.
And it is the right time actually for them to come out with the Apple TV because all of a sudden people are discovering the problems, like Matt said, of moving outside of the Apple ecosystem in the middle of a standard being finalized. I have one of those CK TVs from 3 years ago. It's a 4K. It was the refresh rate was 30. So I can't even do full motion on that. So I feel the pain there.
The other thing, and I know we want to switch topics, but the other thing to point out is that actually realizing that the video that you're seeing is not as intended has become increasingly hard. With HD, it was very easy, right? Especially in the US, right? Where we never, unlike in Europe, we never had SD 16:9. It was, SD was always 4:3. And then when HD came along, not only was the quality better, but the aspect ratio was different. Even so, anecdotally, a lot of people bought their new HD TVs and plugged them in using, their composite video or worse, RF connector, and just got SD, stretched, horrible, nasty video on this HD screen. Yet seemed to be perfectly happy with it. But nonetheless, I mean,
with upscaling, it was absolutely horrible.
Oh, and the weird stretch modes and all of that stuff. Yeah. But the point being that it was, it should have been really straightforward to understand that you are not seeing the image quality as intended. But with 4K and with HDR, it becomes really hard.
Well, and I'll finish this up, David. I agree with what you said, and I'll bring in one more into the mix, and I assure everyone I'm not trying to take down, some of our favorite brands, but I'm a DirecTV customer, and their 4K television on my home UHD set, it just doesn't look that great. So, and with the Apple thing, again, some brand equity maybe being lost with at least this consumer because someone else's service isn't working properly. So the moral of the story, I think, is that to some of the opinions that have been offered here that I agree with, I think we have to be cognizant of overhype, overpromise, and the realization that from a consumer electronics standpoint, people are not able to plug and play these things and see the same visual quality that either they're expecting or that they've been promised.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that too, real quick, Matt, before I roll to the next topic. I think, sorry, Mark, if you wanted to say something, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to kind of ask a question to try and wrap this up. How much of this matters in real world applications? I feel like the 3-axis Venn diagram of people who own the hardware to view 4K HDR, the people who have it properly set up to view 4K HDR, and the people who would even know the difference between HD and 4K HDR. You have a very tiny sliver of people. It's the longest of the long tails right now, and I'm just not sure how much a lot of this matters. And the issues that we're having with certain hardware not displaying properly are very kind of elevated. We're in this upper echelon of people who would care. The masses care.
We've also
all be
just trained the mass market to enjoy 320 by 280 video. Finally, it's taken.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I mean,
Dom, don't you mean square video or vertical?
Yeah, there we go. So I think, and I agree with your point there, Mark, but here's where I think it's practical. One of the things that Apple did, and I think this was a mistake in hindsight. Remember, Apple had a closed ecosystem within its, 4th generation, where it didn't have the apps. What it did when it came out with a 4K device is it also opened up for apps. So you have both the technological issues as well as the app issue, because if you remember in the early days of the iPhone, it was only Apple's apps. Then they opened it up to third-party developers, and there were some growing pains there. We sort of have a combination now of the 4K question and the question of apps. And I think the practical part, especially for you on a production side, is what happens when your client builds an app for the Apple TV and it doesn't display 4K content. They're paying for 4K content to be delivered. Now, that may be a couple years off, because I think, as you've told us, still a lot of stuff in 720p and 1080. But I think it adds in an additional part of the mix that causes problems that Apple may not have anticipated. So speaking of 1080p, HEVC, we've talked about that quite a bit. AVC. David, you mentioned you wanted to talk about what we call context-aware encoding. Give a quick overview of what that is, and then we'll go into a bit of Q&A.
Sure. So probably a year or so ago, Netflix wrote a blog post that was explaining how they were doing some research and ultimately productizing the concept of per title encoding. And essentially, they were saying that, we can get better quality and lower bit rates, and therefore file sizes, and therefore reduced delivery bandwidth, which is really kind of the holy trinity, right? You want to optimize all of those things, and by actually analyzing the content of every single piece of every single title that they were actually encoding, and they were doing some pretty interesting things in terms of measuring visual quality, which typically has been a very sort of old school, I would say, communications engineering style of looking at visual quality using techniques like PSNR, looking at literally signal to noise ratios, which is interesting, but doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how the human visual system reacts to the quality. So I could have two pieces of video with equally good signal to noise ratios, and yet from a visual standpoint, my eyes would tell me that one looks better than the other. So in the industry, there's a technique called SSIM, Structured Similarity Index Model, that effectively models the human visual system and allows us to essentially assign a quality score, a visual quality score, to a piece of video content. And then we can compress it in different ways, do various kinds of optimizations to those pieces of content, and then use that score to tell us whether it looks better or worse from a human visual system standpoint. So that's a very long-winded preamble to some of the work that we've done. So what we wanted to do was to essentially enable our customers to take advantage of optimizing video based on the specific piece of content that they're encoding. So not applying the same encoding settings and the same bitrate ladder to every single piece of content, because it doesn't make sense. There's efficiencies that you can gain by actually choosing to specifically optimize for a particular title. So we introduced a technology called context-aware encoding, not content-aware encoding, but context-aware encoding. And what we're actually doing is we're looking at the type of content, and then making some determinations as to how we want to transcode that, how we want to make various trade-offs. But we're also considering the context in which that content is being viewed. So, you might be viewing the piece of content on a smartphone connected via a 4G connection. That's going to be a very different kind of viewing expectation than if you were watching it on Matt's 4K UHD screen at home. And so the idea there is that based on that context, we can make different kinds of optimizations for that particular piece of content. The net result is that you end up with bitrate savings. And so you can have the same quality of video delivered with a lower bit rate, and the amount of savings is going to depend based on the actual type of video that you're encoding. But it could be anywhere from 20-30% to 40 to 60%, depending on the things that you're actually compressing. And so that becomes really interesting for companies that are delivering video at scale. If you're only streaming a couple of videos here and there, you don't care. But if you are delivering, millions of videos a month, then any way that you can actually save bandwidth in delivering that content is going to be helpful. And not only that, the videos that you're delivering look better than the videos that you might have been delivering before with the same bitrate. So I've just said a lot of things without really pausing. And it is kind of a complex, interesting topic.
And one of the things that I wanted to mention here is you said context-aware, and that's what you all are doing. And I apologize. I'm going back to my Euclid days where we were actually looking at it on a scene level or a shot level, which is essentially the content-aware piece of it. Mm-hmm. But I think the point is very well taken. You're not just looking at how do we optimize the video visually? It's how do we optimize the video visually for a particular target delivery, whether it's cellular devices, whether it's cell devices on Wi-Fi, whether it's laptops, etc. How there's a fairly wide scale there in the bitrate ladder when you look at, say, Apple's best practices for delivering across cellular to a small iPhone screen versus an Apple TV at even 1080p. How do you deal with that wide gamut, or do you target particular groups of devices by screen size, etc.?
So today we target particular groups of devices. Essentially, we have we rely on the customer to tell us, hey, most of my content is going to be, I want to optimize my content for smartphone type devices connected via a cellular network. However, the goal is to make the system more intelligent than that, and actually, take advantage of the fact that we know about that viewing environment. And so over time, we could actually then be closing that transcoding, optimization, transcoding, delivery, playback loop, and be able to, based on the playback environment, so that would not only be the device, but also the connectivity and the device capabilities, and then make changes to those profiles for the transcoding. And so over time, that would actually get better for the customer. And so you can imagine a situation where, let's say the network changes from 4G to a higher speed 4G or 5G. Your entire library could transparently actually change to be optimized for that better quality delivery technology.
And then let's talk about one last thing around this. I not only had the conversations with you at Stream Media West, I had conversations with Dror Gill at Beamer. Great guy, I'd never met him before, very impressed. Of course, part of their model is looking at ways to both push HEVC while also acknowledging that there are still legs in AVC with content-aware encoding and context-aware encoding. Mm-hmm. For you all, the focus at the moment is primarily in AVC or HEVC?
So for us, the focus is AVC simply because that's where the majority of our customers are actually focused. We have a handful of customers that are delivering HEVC content, so it's 4K UHD, HDR, HEVC content. But by and large, the majority of our customers are still in an AVC world. And in fact, in many cases, they're not going above, especially outside, the more developed markets. They're not even going above SD in many cases, which is actually fascinating. And there's a variety of reasons for that. There's several pretty interesting reasons. One is kind of the obvious one, just technical limitations, right? The network just doesn't support, delivering reliably above SD, although with context-aware encoding, it actually could. So you might be able to get, a 720p rendition in the same bit rate. But sorry, go ahead.
Let's hold that for a second, because I think that's a key point. That was one of the things Euclid, Beamer, now what you all are doing with Yuri on board. The idea there is if you can either offer more overhead for the cellular network, or which allows content to go through without buffering as much, or if you can do so much in terms of the visual quality consistency at a reduced bandwidth, you have the possibility to move from one resolution to another. Are we there at this point, or are we sort of still halfway between resolutions, say, in terms of the bandwidth savings?
It really depends on the content, and so, it's the old compression adage, right, where, the fast moving stuff, compresses worse than the talking heads. I mean, the same thing kind of holds true. So you might find that you can squeeze, that higher resolution version into a lower bit rate if there isn't as much motion. Whereas if you had something that was, fast moving sports, you'd be stuck with the SD piece. So, unfortunately, it's one of those things where the answer is it depends. But what I found fascinating is that there tend to be a couple of business reasons why, even if it's technically possible to deliver an HD version of the content, the customer doesn't want to do so. One is licensing. In some cases, they just don't have rights to stream anything above SD. and the any licensing discussion tends to be quite complicated and drawn out and involving and expensive and so on and so forth. And then the other one is, in many cases, customers, so these might be streaming service providers, have a higher tier of service that their customers pay for that gives them access to HD. So they don't want to give everyone access to the HD version of the asset, much as in the case of, Netflix, for example, will charge you extra if you want the 4K content. On the standard plan, you don't get 4K, much as if you wanted to buy a movie or a TV show on iTunes, it's a lower price for SD and a higher price for HD. So you have that factor playing into it as well, which I found quite interesting.
Cool. That's actually very, very interesting. I hadn't even thought about the SD licensing piece. So Dom, I'm going to hand off to you. I've got to go pick my youngest daughter up for a meeting, but just going to hand off to you, and I know you're going to pick a topic or two to run forward. David, Matt, Mark, great to see you guys, and look forward to watching the archived version of this within a couple hours.
Cool, thanks, Tim. Excellent stuff. So, I was going to sort of steer the conversation towards some stuff that I just posted an article today, looking at the conference season and what I thought was topical there. I don't know how your conference seasons were in general, guys. I don't know if you consider the autumn a conference season, but for me, September till the end of November is a very clear 3-month run of just endless conferences. And for my part, I did IBC, which is, it's quite an important one for our particular workspace. But IBC was quite a strange vibe this year. It was very definitely nothing particularly pizzazz new, I didn't think, but I felt that there was a lot of telco movement into the broadcast space. And I think that having then followed it up with a bunch of different more niche conferences on carrier tech and carrier evolution, the carriers definitely seem to be, I think, universally arming up at the moment. And so a lot of my conclusion in the article, looking back on this year, is I think the telcos they've been aware of and testing video. I think Netflix has largely proven that you can run online services and make enormous valuations in markets out of online video services, and they're very much the poster boy of doing that. And I think the telcos don't like seeing their wholesale customers making so much profit, and are kind of moving up the stack and are trying to re-engineer their infrastructure so that they can themselves offer ad hoc CDN services, ad hoc transcoding services within their networks. So my sense is that there's a groundswell of the telcos doing a lot of base architecture work, getting involved with containers, getting involved with virtualization in different orchestration levels, and tinkering with stuff a little bit, proving models to themselves. But I strongly feel that over the next 12 to 18 months, what we're going to see is a resurgence of telcos in the streaming and in the broadcast conferences, like we haven't probably seen for maybe 5 to 10 years. I don't know if that's something you guys share, and if that's a view and experience you shared of this autumn, but it feels like the telcos are coming with a lot of momentum, albeit a little bit slowly.
I think, Dom, it's a good point. I think we're going to see, specifically here in the U.S., and I expect we'll see it in Europe as well, the rise of 5G networks, that these operators can do things that they're, they could do before, but they could do at orders of magnitude less expensive. It's very expensive to run fiber to the premise and provide the throughput needed for the channel lineups that they've got today. So I think we're going to see more and more of these operators, if you will, ditch the legacy heavy iron that they've used to provide the transcode services or the channel lineups and the stat mux sort of delivery that they've had for years, in favor of cloud-based workflows that leverage OTT and streaming technologies that traverse 5G networks so that they can get to any home without having a fixed line there.
Yeah, I strongly agree. I think 5G is exciting. It sort of takes me back to when there were the big fiber rollouts at the end of the 90s, and there was lots of relatively new homogeneous, clean, easy to configure infrastructure appearing. And in some ways, 5G is another, I think, another rollout, which is going to provide some opportunity for people to try things that became difficult with the with some of the legacy network infrastructures. You know, so there's the ones that are catching my interest at the moment are BEER, the bit indexed explicit replication, which is kind of a rebirth of multicast, which is always going to catch my interest, and I think mobile edge compute, which is more about the generic provision of services over mobile networks, is going to create an environment where telcos aren't going to necessarily need to license in third-party CDN technology. They're going to roll their own specific to their infrastructure, and in fact, they may even just provide the infrastructure as a service model to say to third parties, come in and do what you want to do and operate these complex fog type architectures for a little while, and if it works, maybe we'll acquire you. You know, that sort of feels how things are evolving.
Well, it definitely feels like this has been the year of the CDN, which kind of surprised me, I have to say. You know, having seen the CDN market for years and years become just more and more commoditized, and you know, CDN companies being acquired and so on, it seems like literally every week I get at least one call from, you know, a company that is doing CDN or CDN-like, you know, delivery type technologies. Certainly, some of it's, you know, peer-to-peer based, which I think is pretty interesting for certain applications. But you know, there are also just, you know, standalone CDNs that people are building out, and then as you alluded to, I mean, there's certainly I would say impetus for telcos to go off and you know, roll their own, leverage their infrastructure to provide CDN capabilities, even if it's just to their own, you know, subscriber base. So, you know, Comcast Wholesale would be an example of that in the US, and you know, others are doing the same sorts of things.
I think, you know, the appearance of the Netflix on Connect caches was disruptive in its own right. I think it blurs the line between OTT and IPTV quite nicely, and that certainly was. In some cases, at some of the CDN conferences this year, it was quite a job to explain to people the differences between OTT and IPTV and operator CDNs and so on. But you're right. I was really surprised. The Content Delivery World conference in London was the strongest it's been for 5 years. I think it was really, really busy. It's co-located with OTT TV World, which is probably about twice the size, but I think it has a higher churn rate. I think people come into OTTV with yacht projects that they think they're going to launch and become the next Netflix of whichever niche you want to put in the end of that sentence. And I think they come and go a bit. But the CDN was just all telco, all people heading R&D, but you could tell that there was an expectation that it was going to be followed through with some quite significant investment into the infrastructures and so on. And I think the telcos are like sleeping giants that are waking up. Even if you look at some of the IPTV stuff that they did over the last decade, I think those will look like trials and proofs of concept compared with some of the services. You know, when somebody launches a BT Vision in the States, that's going to be quite disruptive, I think.
Tom, I don't know how much you've been following the you know, the battle over net neutrality here in the States and its kind of apparently impending demise. But what are your thoughts on the correlation between that and the reemergence of telcos into our industry?
So it's funny because in nearly every other discussion and debate, I would normally think that, or context, that you would normally expect me to be the one flying the strongest flag for the net neutrality arguments. But I actually think it's nonsense. I think several years ago I did an internet policy diploma, and we were debating the rift between Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. And that it is from that rift that the net neutrality debate has forever emanated, really. You know, Vint sees it as something which I think is I personally see as being infinitely tied up with existing monopoly laws, and monopoly and competition law should be controlling the major concerns that people have about, for example, Comcast is your incumbent, you have no other choice. So if Comcast bandwidth throttles one news source in favor of another, that's a social problem, and I get that, but that is and should be regulated by monopoly and competition law. The technical arguments are very different, because from a purist standpoint, there is no internet to be regulated. There are billions of private peerings and billions of transit network relationships. And if you start regulating that those have to operate in certain ways, technically, then you really head to a fight to zero, where really we have to have lowest common denominator bandwidth, and we'd all have to be streaming at 9600 baud again, and it would go back to one fax image a minute. So, you know, there are two things that are very badly conflated, from my opinion. Anyway, we're not here to hear my opinion. We want to hear Matt and David's opinion about things.
No, I don't have an opinion on net neutrality. I just want fast internet.
I think it's more of a problem. I think it seems to be more of a problem in the States. I think
you're right, and Dom, I think, you know, you really hit the nail on the head with the incumbent monopoly aspect, because, you know, I think as people can tell from my accent, I was not born in the US. Been here about 20 years, and one of the things that really astonished me when I first established TV service here was I had no choice. I mean, yes, there are multiple companies out there, but only one of them served my area, and that just never made sense to me at the time, and still, you know, is something that surprises me.
And I think that'll change. It's a great point, David. I think we're going to see in the next couple of years the tethers removed from some of these big companies like Comcast, like AT&T, from providing you service because they previously negotiated a franchise with the city that you live in. I think that they're the days ahead with the technology we've touched on here, Dom, with 5G networks or with existing fiber. I think the government is going to relax the controls over. I can only provide a channel lineup to David because he lives in Kirkland, Washington. I think, you know, me being in Dallas, Texas, and I can't get AT&T service to my curb, I think the future will provide for a scenario where I can subscribe to a 30 or 40 or 50 channel bundle with them that includes live sports at a similar price point to what I'm paying today for a DirecTV service. I think that's coming.
Yeah, I mean, there's bound to. I think the trend towards operators, you know, it used to be called triple play, didn't it? And then quad play, and then N play, and then eventually it all became IP. And I think as the broadcast industry follows that trend into the IP space, and the telcos work out how to make their money out of it and creep up the stack and offer, you know, I personally think the telcos have probably got their eyes more on Amazon's wealth.
You're absolutely right.
And I think they view the Amazon cloud, the runaway success of the Amazon cloud, as something that they identify with, because they run tin wires and networks, and they're hungry to creep up the stack. I mean, just as a last question, especially to you guys, you know, I can't remember what it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was always a very close tie-up between your company and a particular CDN, and then that CDN moved up the stack and changed its positioning and bought an OVP, and sort of disrupted that relationship somewhat. At least from a spectator's point of view, that's what appeared to have happened. And I think that if you forewind to today, the company that I think faces that sort of transition is very much, well, the companies particularly are very much the very largest CDNs. I can see them suddenly having their value proposition to the market displaced, and the telcos just sitting there saying, well, why would you go into a CDN? You only want to deliver into the UK, so just connect directly to BT's CDN, or you only want to deliver into the US 5G market, so connect to Verizon CDN, or whatever it may be. But I think that could really upset the apple cart at the very top end of the very largest CDN industry.
Yeah, I think David touched on this earlier. I mean, you look at, you know, a company like Comcast with their own native backbone and they're delivered to the home, they could reach, I think it's somewhere like 40 to 45% of the U.S. market, right? At nothing, zero cost, really. And then conversely, you see a lot of DIY deployments at places like Apple and Facebook and Google that support your argument. So, yeah, I think that there will be more disruption, not only by the telcos, but also by these larger traditional companies who feel that they don't need the commoditized CDNs to deliver the content.
Yeah. Well, guys, it's amazing how quick an hour goes once you flick the live switch, but we've come to the end. Any last thoughts from any of you guys? We've got next month, we've got a bit of an internet radio special. I'm doing my best to get some of the very old school, or some of the authors of the very old school streaming servers on. And we've got some folks from streaming CDN, and so it'll be very focused on internet radio next month, which I think it's long overdue. We need to talk geek about it. Audio streaming, it's big. The volumes of listeners are huge, but hopefully you guys will be able to join us, and you guys will. Any last comments from my guests? You've all clammed up.
No, it's been great to be here. Thank you, Dom.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, guys, let's see if I can actually get this to cue in. It'd be amazing if we can get this done.